The Rock sat a mile and a quarter from the San Francisco waterfront. On quiet nights, the men locked inside Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary could hear laughter carrying across the bay from the city. They could smell grilled fish drifting from Fisherman's Wharf when the wind shifted east. They could not respond. They could not leave. Number 19 on this list turned the island into a war zone for 2 days. Number 7 involved a man who became the most famous prisoner in America for something he never actually did on Alcatraz. And number 1 might be the cruelest detail of all. Hit subscribe, because once you see what daily life on this island actually looked like, you will never think of Alcatraz the same way. Here are 25 things that reveal what life was really like inside Alcatraz. Number 25. The cell. Every inmate on Alcatraz lived in a cell that measured 5 feet wide and 9 feet long. That is smaller than most walk-in closets built today. The cell held a steel cot bolted to the wall, a cold water sink, a toilet with no seat, and a small fold-down shelf that served as a desk. There was no privacy. The front of the cell was open steel bars, and a guard could see everything inside at any time of day or night. Each man was assigned his own cell. Alcatraz did not double up. That was one of the few comforts the island offered, and the men who transferred in from overcrowded state prisons noticed it immediately. The ceiling was 7 feet high. A tall man could touch both walls with his arms outstretched. This was home, sometimes for decades. Number 24. The daily count. Alcatraz guards counted every inmate 12 to 13 times per day. The first count came before dawn. The last count came after lights out. In between, the men were counted when they left their cells, when they entered the mess hall, when they returned from work, and when they stepped into the recreation yard. If a single count came up short, the entire prison locked down. Every man went back to his cell. Every guard reported to station. The count was repeated until the number matched. On the rare occasions when a count failed twice, armed officers swept the island from the shoreline to the roof of the cell house. No other federal prison in the country counted this often. The system existed for one reason: Alcatraz could not afford a missing man. Number 23. Hot showers. The showers on Alcatraz ran hot, not warm, hot. This was not a kindness. The warden wanted every man accustomed to heated water so that the freezing bay would hit harder if anyone tried to swim. The water temperature in San Francisco Bay averaged around 50 degrees year-round, cold enough to cause hypothermia in under 30 minutes. A man used to scalding showers would feel the shock immediately. His muscles would seize, his breathing would shorten. The policy was never written into the official rule book, but multiple former inmates and guards confirmed it in interviews and memoirs after the prison closed. It was one of the quieter ways Alcatraz discouraged escape without ever laying a hand on anyone. Number 22. The rule of silence. For the first years of its operation as a federal penitentiary, Alcatraz enforced a strict rule of silence. Inmates were forbidden from speaking to each other in the cell house, in the mess hall, and during transfers between buildings. Talking in the recreation yard was permitted, but only at a low volume. The rule was modeled on older penitentiary systems that believed silence forced reflection and repentance. In practice, it created a pressure that many inmates described as worse than physical punishment. Hundreds of men, breathing, shuffling, and eating in near-total silence, produced an atmosphere that former inmate Jim Quillen later called unbearable. The rule was gradually relaxed through the late 1930s and formally abandoned by the early 1940s, but the reputation of Alcatraz as the silent prison stuck for decades afterward. Number 21. Broadway, Michigan Boulevard, and Times Square. The inmates gave names to every corridor inside the cell house. The main walkway between B Block and C Block was Broadway. The corridor along A Block was Michigan Boulevard. The open area where the main corridors crossed was Times Square. These were not official designations. They were inmate slang that the guards eventually adopted because the names were simply more practical than cell block coordinates. The irony was deliberate. Broadway was the loudest, busiest stretch of the prison. Michigan Boulevard was quieter, running along the unused A block, and Times Square was where you stood when the whole institution could see you. The names carried a dark humor that said something about the men who lived there. They named their cage after the freest, most glamorous places in the country. Number 20. The recreation yard. Weekend recreation was the closest thing to freedom on Alcatraz. Inmates who maintained good behavior earned access to the yard on Saturday and Sunday afternoons. The yard was a concrete-walled enclosure on the south side of the island, open to the sky but ringed by armed guard towers. The men played softball, bridge, chess, and dominoes. Some simply walked the perimeter and talked. The yard had a direct view of the San Francisco skyline that the cell house walls blocked during the week. Privileges could be revoked for any infraction, and time in the yard was the single most effective behavioral lever the warden held. Losing yard time hurt more than solitary for many inmates, because solitary was finite, but exclusion from the only social space on the island felt like disappearing. Number 19. The Battle of Alcatraz. On May 2, 1946, inmate Bernard Coy overpowered a guard in the gun gallery above D Block and got his hands on a rifle and a .45 caliber pistol. Within minutes, he and 5 other inmates had taken control of the cell house and captured 9 guards as hostages. Their plan was to reach the recreation yard, make it to the water, and disappear. It failed almost immediately. The key that would have unlocked the yard door did not work. The escape was over before it started, but the violence was just beginning. The 6 inmates barricaded themselves inside the cell house with the hostages. Coy and his men knew they were not getting off the island. They decided to fight until there was nothing left to fight with. The standoff lasted 2 full days. The United States Marines were called in. Guards fired rifles and threw grenades into the cell house corridors. The noise carried across the bay to the city, and San Francisco residents stood on the waterfront watching smoke rise from the island. When it ended, 2 guards and 3 inmates were dead. 14 guards had been wounded. The surviving inmates were put on trial for murder. 2 of them, Moran Thompson and Sam Shockley, were executed in the gas chamber at San Quentin in December 1948, roughly 2.5 years after the uprising. The third, Clarence Carnes, was 19 years old at the time of the battle. He had entered Alcatraz at the age of 18, the youngest man ever sent to the island. Carnes did not leave federal custody until 1973, and he died 15 years after that. The Battle of Alcatraz was the bloodiest event in the prison's history, and it proved what the warden had always feared. The most dangerous moment on the island was not when a man tried to leave, it was when he realized he could not. Number 18. The Guard Families. Alcatraz was not just a prison, it was a small, isolated community. The families of correctional officers lived in apartments and cottages on the island's south side, separated from the cell house by a few hundred yards of concrete and a chain-link fence. Children grew up on Alcatraz. They rode a boat to school in San Francisco every morning and came back every afternoon. They played on the island's slopes within earshot of the cell house. Some of the children later recalled that certain well-behaved inmates were assigned to household duties in the residential area, tending gardens and doing repairs while guard families went about their daily lives just a few feet away. It was one of the strangest arrangements in the federal prison system, and the children who grew up there described an oddly normal childhood in the most abnormal setting imaginable. Number 17. The Foghorn. The foghorn on Alcatraz sounded every 22 seconds during heavy fog. San Francisco Bay is one of the foggiest waterways on the Pacific coast, and the horn could run for hours, sometimes days, without stopping. The sound was a deep, low blast designed to warn passing ships, and it carried straight through the concrete walls of the cell house. Former inmates described it as maddening. The blast came at a frequency that made sleep nearly impossible, and during long fog banks that settled over the bay for a week or more, the horn ran continuously, day and night. There was no way to block it out. The cells had no windows that closed and no insulation. The foghorn was not punishment. It was simply geography. But for the men inside, it became one of the defining sounds of their confinement, a deep pulse that reminded them every 22 seconds exactly where they were. Number 16. D Block and the Hole. D Block was the disciplinary unit on Alcatraz, and the Hole was the worst of it. The men sent to D Block were confined for 24 hours a day with almost no privileges, no yard time, no work, no library. The Hole was a set of cells at the bottom of D Block with solid steel doors that blocked all light. A man sent to the Hole lived in total darkness. He received reduced rations. He had no mattress during the day. The steel door opened only when a guard slid a tray through the slot at the base. Inmates spent anywhere from a few days to 19 days in the Hole, the official maximum, though some men reported longer stretches. Former inmate Whitey Bulger described it as the one place on the island where the silence truly broke a man. Number 15. The snitch boxes. Alcatraz installed metal detectors at the entrance to the mess hall in the 1930s, years before the devices became common in airports or courthouses. The inmates called them snitch boxes. Every man walked through one on his way to eat and again on his way out. The purpose was to prevent anyone from smuggling a piece of metal, a sharpened spoon, a bolt, a scrap of wire, anything that could become a weapon or a tool. The machines were sensitive enough to pick up a belt buckle, and false alarms were constant. When the detector sounded, the inmate stepped aside and a guard patted him down by hand. The daily routine of walking through the snitch box twice per meal, 3 times a day, became one of those small humiliations that inmates said defined life on Alcatraz more than any single dramatic event. Number 14. The 1962 escape. On the night of June 11, 1962, 3 men vanished from Alcatraz. Frank Morris and brothers John and Clarence Anglin had spent months preparing. They carved through the deteriorating concrete around the ventilation grills in the back of their cells using sharpened spoons and a drill improvised from a stolen vacuum cleaner motor. They fashioned dummy heads from soap, toilet paper, and real human hair collected from the prison barbershop. They placed the heads on their pillows, pulled the blankets up, and climbed through the holes in the wall into an unguarded utility corridor behind the cells. From there, they reached the roof, slid down a drain pipe, and made it to the northeast shore of the island. They inflated a raft made from more than 50 stolen raincoats glued together with contact cement, and they paddled into the bay. They were never seen again. The official investigation concluded that the 3 men most likely drowned in the cold, fast-moving currents of the bay. No bodies were ever recovered. No confirmed sighting was ever reported. But the case was never formally closed. In 2013, the San Francisco field office received a letter purportedly written by John Anglin, claiming that all 3 men had survived and that he was living under an assumed name. The letter was never authenticated. The 1962 escape is the only case in the history of Alcatraz where inmates reached the water and were not recovered, dead or alive. The uncertainty is the reason it endures. Every other escape attempt on the island ended with a body, a capture, or a surrender. This one ended with nothing. The 3 men either died in the darkest, coldest stretch of water on the Pacific coast, or they pulled off something that 29 years of maximum security said was impossible. Number 13. Mail censorship. Every piece of mail entering or leaving Alcatraz passed through the hands of a censor. Inmates were allowed to write and receive letters, but the content was read, reviewed, and often redacted before delivery. Any reference to prison conditions, other inmates, legal matters, or complaints about staff was blacked out or the letter was returned. Outgoing mail was limited to a set number of approved correspondents, usually immediate family, and every letter had to be written in English. Incoming packages were opened, inspected, and frequently confiscated. Books and magazines could be received, but only after review. The censorship was not unique to Alcatraz, but the strictness was. At other federal prisons, inmates could correspond with attorneys and journalists with relative freedom. On Alcatraz, the warden controlled the narrative. Number 12. The library. The library on Alcatraz held roughly 15,000 volumes by the time the prison closed. It was one of the best-stocked prison libraries in the federal system, and the inmates used it heavily. Books were delivered to the cells by inmate librarians who pushed carts along Broadway and the other corridors. Requests were made by written slip, and the selection ranged from pulp westerns to legal references to philosophy. Robert Stroud spent years reading scientific texts on ornithology and disease in his cell. Other inmates studied law well enough to file their own appeals. The library was one of the few privileges that was almost never revoked, even for men in D Block. Reading was considered a stabilizing force by the administration, and the warden understood that a literate, occupied prisoner was less likely to cause trouble than a bored one. Number 11. Work assignments. Most inmates on Alcatraz worked. The primary industry was laundry. Alcatraz operated one of the largest institutional laundries on the West Coast, processing uniforms and linens for military installations across the San Francisco Bay Area. Other inmates worked in the tailor shop, the cobbler shop, the furniture factory, or the kitchen. Work was considered a privilege, not a punishment, and it was one of the few things that broke the monotony of the daily routine. Inmates earned small amounts of credit for their labor, typically a few cents per hour, which could be spent at the commissary on tobacco, toiletries, or stationery. Refusing to work was a disciplinary infraction. The most coveted assignments were outdoor jobs, particularly gardening on the island's slopes, because they offered fresh air and a view of the bay that the cell house walls blocked entirely. Number 10. The information blackout. For the first several years of operation, Alcatraz did not allow newspapers, radio, or any outside news media inside the cell house. The warden did not want inmates knowing what was happening in the outside world. Knowledge of current events could fuel escape plans, enable coded communication with accomplices, or remind the men too sharply of everything they had lost. The blackout was loosened in the 1940s when headphones and a limited radio system were installed, piping music into individual cells. Newspapers came later, and even then, certain sections were removed before distribution. Some former inmates described stepping off the island after years inside and discovering the world had moved on without them as the most disorienting moment of their lives. Number 9. Visitation. Inmates on Alcatraz were allowed one visit per month. The visitor list was restricted to immediate family and approved individuals only. Visits took place in a small room divided by thick glass, and all conversation went through a monitored telephone handset. Physical contact was not permitted. A guard sat within earshot of every conversation, and any discussion of legal matters, other inmates, or prison conditions could end the visit immediately. The visit lasted a set period, usually around 2 hours, and travel to the island required advanced scheduling and a boat ride from the San Francisco dock. For families who had traveled across the country, the visit often felt brutally short. Many inmates went months or years without a single visitor, either because their families could not afford the trip or because the restrictions made the experience too painful to repeat. Number 8. Medical care. Alcatraz employed one full-time physician for the entire inmate population, which at its peak numbered just over 300 men. The prison hospital occupied a section of the main building and was equipped for basic treatment, minor surgery, and dental work. Serious cases were transferred to the United States Public Health Service Hospital in Springfield, Missouri, a trip that required armed escort and days of travel. Mental health care was minimal. Psychiatric evaluation existed on paper, but in practice, inmates dealing with severe psychological distress had few options beyond the prison doctor and whatever coping mechanisms they could develop on their own. Several men on Alcatraz suffered documented mental breakdowns during their time on the island, and at least one inmate, Roof Percival, mutilated himself with a hatchet in the prison workshop in a desperate act that shocked even the hardened population around him. Number 7. The Birdman Who Never Had Birds. Robert Stroud arrived on Alcatraz in 1942 and spent the next 17 years on the island. He was already one of the most famous prisoners in America, known as the Birdman of Alcatraz for the decades he had spent raising and studying canaries at Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary in Kansas. He had written 2 published books on bird diseases and had become something of a folk hero in the press, portrayed as a gentle, misunderstood scholar trapped by an unjust system. The reality was more complicated. Stroud had killed 2 men, one of them a prison guard at Leavenworth, and his transfer to Alcatraz was ordered specifically because the Bureau of Prisons wanted to end the public spectacle his bird operation had become. On Alcatraz, Stroud was not allowed to keep birds. He never had a single bird on the island. The nickname that made him famous referred entirely to work he did at a different prison years before he ever set foot on the Rock. What Stroud did on Alcatraz was read. He consumed books at a pace that impressed even the librarians, working his way through medical texts, legal volumes, and history. He also wrote a manuscript on the history of the federal prison system that ran to thousands of pages. The Bureau of Prisons refused to allow him to publish it. Stroud spent 6 years in D-block segregation and 11 in the prison hospital before being transferred to the Federal Medical Facility in Springfield, Missouri. He died in 1963, the same year the prison closed, having spent 54 of his 73 years behind bars. The Birdman of Alcatraz never kept a bird on Alcatraz, never published his second major work, and never set foot outside a federal institution after the age of 19. His story endures not because of what he did on the island, but because of the distance between the myth and the man who sat alone in that cell, reading. Number 6. The water. The bay surrounding Alcatraz averaged around 50 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. The currents in that section of San Francisco Bay ran fast and unpredictable, with tidal flows that could pull a swimmer sideways at speeds exceeding 4 knots. The combination of cold and current was the prison's most effective security measure. A strong swimmer in calm, warm water could cover the 1.25 miles to the mainland in under 30 minutes. In the bay, hypothermia began setting in within 15 to 20 minutes, and the current could carry a man past the Golden Gate and out into the open Pacific before he even realized he was off course. Of the 14 known escape attempts involving 36 inmates over 29 years, not one resulted in a confirmed successful crossing. The water did what the walls could not guarantee. Number 5. Personal possessions. An inmate on Alcatraz was permitted to keep a small number of personal items in his cell. The list was short: a comb, a toothbrush, toothpaste, a safety razor checked out and returned after each use, a limited supply of tobacco if purchased from the commissary, stationery for approved correspondence, and whatever library books he currently had on loan. Photographs of family members were allowed but had to be approved and were subject to inspection at any time. Anything beyond this list was contraband. Playing cards, dice, personal clothing, jewelry, and cash were all forbidden. The cell was searched regularly, and any unauthorized item could result in time in D-block. The enforced minimalism was deliberate. Alcatraz stripped a man down to almost nothing and made even a photograph of his wife a regulated privilege. Number 4. The staffing ratio. Alcatraz maintained a correctional staff-to-inmate ratio of roughly 1 to 3, the highest in the entire federal prison system. Most federal penitentiaries operated at ratios closer to 1 to 10 or 1 to 12. The dense staffing was expensive, and it was one of the primary reasons the Bureau of Prisons eventually recommended closing the institution. Maintaining a full guard force on an island that required boat transport for every shift change, every supply delivery, and every piece of equipment pushed operating costs to several times the national average per inmate. The ratio also meant that the men on Alcatraz were watched more closely than inmates anywhere else in the country. There was no crowd to disappear into. Every face was known. Every movement was noted. Number 3. The transfer. No judge ever sentenced a man to Alcatraz. Inmates were transferred there by the Bureau of Prisons, usually from other federal penitentiaries where they had proven too violent, too disruptive, or too famous to manage. The transfer was designed to intimidate. A man selected for Alcatraz was pulled from his cell without warning, shackled, and placed on a train under armed escort. The journey could take days. Upon arrival in the Bay Area, the inmate was loaded onto a boat for the short crossing to the island. Former inmates described the first sight of Alcatraz from the water as the moment the reality set in. The island looked smaller than they had imagined, and the cell house on top of the hill looked exactly like what it was. Number 2. The closing. Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary closed on March 21, 1963. The decision was not driven by politics or scandal. It was driven by salt. Constant exposure to salt air and salt water had corroded the concrete, the steel, the plumbing, and the electrical systems until the cost of repair exceeded the cost of building a new facility on the mainland. Attorney General Robert Kennedy signed the closure order. The remaining inmates were transferred to other federal institutions over a period of weeks. The island sat empty until 1969, when a group of Native American activists occupied it for 19 months in a protest over federal treatment of indigenous peoples. Today, Alcatraz is a national park site, and more than 1 million visitors tour the cell house every year. Most of them stand inside a 5-by-9-foot cell, look at the bars, and try to imagine what it felt like. Number 1. The view. The cruelest feature of Alcatraz was not the cells, the silence, the cold, or the isolation. It was the view. From certain points on the island, particularly the recreation yard and the upper tiers of B Block, inmates could see San Francisco in sharp, painful detail. They could see the lights of the city at night. They could see cars moving along the Embarcadero. On clear days, they could make out people walking on the waterfront, living ordinary lives 1.25 miles away. On New Year's Eve, the sounds of celebration carried across the water, and the men in their cells could hear horns, music, and laughter drifting through the bars. The wind sometimes brought the smell of the city with it: coffee roasting, bread from the bakeries, the salt and fish of the wharf. Warden James Johnston, who oversaw the conversion from military prison to federal penitentiary in 1934, understood this effect and considered it part of the design. The proximity to normal life was the point. Every other maximum security prison in the country was built far from population centers, surrounded by farmland or forest, where the outside world was an abstraction. Alcatraz put freedom directly in front of a man's eyes and made him look at it every single day. Former inmates who served time at multiple institutions consistently named this as the hardest part. Not the rules, not the guards, not the cold. The fact that everything they had lost was right there, visible, audible, close enough to smell, and completely, permanently out of reach. That was life on Alcatraz, not the Hollywood version, not the legend. The real thing, down to the 5-by-9 cell, the 22-second foghorn, and the city lights that never stopped shining across the water. If this list changed the way you think about the rock in the bay, drop a comment and tell us which detail surprised you the most. And if you have not already, hit subscribe for more stories about the places and the people history tried to forget.